Welcome to Talking Beats with me, Daniel Lalchuk. If you like what you hear, I'd love you to give us a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. Write a review, and if you're so inclined, tell a friend or family member. They might like the show as much as you do. Be sure to visit our website, talkingbeats.com, where you can find much more information about the guests, support the show in various ways, sign up for the newsletter, and be in touch directly with me. As always, the dialogue continues on social media at Talking Beats Podcast. I'm so glad you're here with me. Now, to the conversation. On today's program, journalist Roger Lowenstein. He reported for the Wall Street Journal for more than a decade. His work has appeared there in Bloomberg, the New York Times, Washington Post, Fortune, Atlantic, and other publications. His books include New York Times bestsellers Buffett, When Genius Failed, and The End of Wall Street. He's here with a new book in hand called Ways and Means, Lincoln and His Cabinet and the Financing of the Civil War. When the Confederate States seceded in 1860 following Abraham Lincoln's election, the U.S. Treasury had no money, no federal bank, and no authorization to raise taxes. But in this sea of great national problems, Lincoln saw opportunity, and along with the legendary 37th Congress, created a situation some call the Second American Revolution. What lessons can we learn today, and how does the new war in Ukraine color our understanding of the past, and maybe vice versa? Well, Roger Lowenstein joins me now to explain this and more. Welcome.
Daniel, it's a pleasure to be on the show.
Why did you want to write this book? You're a finance person and a history person, but foremost, perhaps a finance person. Why this book? Was it a fascination with this unique period in American history? Was it Lincoln himself, who was endlessly plumbable and fascinating? Why was it?
Well, you hit on 2 points right there. Lincoln is endlessly, yes, fascinating and also appealing the more you read about him and his wisdom, his humility, a characteristic not always in evidence among modern political leaders. The Civil War period, obviously, is also tremendously compelling and perhaps has an unfortunate resonance to the divisions, the divisiveness in American society today. But the specific thing that drew me in was I just hadn't realized until I did how revolutionary the Lincoln government was. I knew that, of course, they had to fight the Civil War, and I knew that he freed the slaves. Neither of them small items, obviously. But when I learned, really growing out of my previous book, that Lincoln had advanced a truly different conception for the federal government. He said in his first address to Congress that government, the leading purpose of government was to elevate the condition of men. And his government went on to introduce a whole host of social and economic measures to put the government in a major role in the economic affairs of the nation and in promoting prosperity and opportunity. Perhaps as Alexander Hamilton might have wished it in the previous century, and certainly as, say, Franklin Roosevelt wished it in the next century, but he did it then. And it was a quite remarkable revolution, and I think one that's largely unknown to most Americans who concentrate on Lincoln's achievements in fighting the war and emancipation.
Well, indeed, take us back to that previous century. Talk about the Jefferson versus the Hamilton approach to looking at what the federal government, I guess you could put the word federal in quotes, in a sense, what the federal government could do, shouldn't be doing, that there was a huge split between Jefferson and Hamilton, and they articulated very different beliefs about what government had to be.
That's right. There was always this tension in the American political culture. It really goes back even further. We rebelled against the British Crown out of opposition to centralism and strong central rule and taxation coming from the central government at that point in England, and that current remained through political life. The Hamilton wanted a more robust, vigorous central government that would really be an engine of prosperity and investment and what we would call modern capitalism. But he basically lost out, and the conception of the founders in general was the Jeffersonian concept of the government that governed least. That was so pronounced that we started out not even with the Constitution, but with the Articles of Confederation, which was basically just a piece of paper that sort of unified the 13 colonies and provided for a common defense. Even after the Constitution, Jefferson referred to the United States as a confederated fabric. Not really a united nation, but just a confederation of states. And
did he like it like that? I mean, is that what he wanted it to be, or it was simply
it was mostly what he wanted to be. When he was president, he was a little more activist. But that's when he had the power. He wasn't. He was a little less afraid of using it. But essentially, yes. And in retirement, he grew even warier. He issued a solemn declaration that the U.S. was drifting towards what he considered to be a tyrannical government, mainly because the Federalists, the other party then, was advocating that the federal government do things like build roads, the infrastructure, the build back better of their day. And roads are very important. If you lived out in places like Kentucky or Ohio, the roads are very bad. It took forever to get goods to the east. In fact, it was cheaper and easier to ship them from England to the East Coast and from what we now call the Middle West of the United States. And just for common prosperity, and transportation was hugely important, but they didn't want it. Much the way we have great debates today over national health care. There were great debates over so-called internal improvements, building roads, canals, railroads, and 6 different presidents, all of them Democrats, Jefferson's party, vetoed such plans. And they also vetoed things like the Homestead Act, whereby the federal government would give land to settlers who moved west and farmed the territory. There was like a bill to create colleges for the middle class. That was vetoed. And when you got to 1860, the federal government was really pretty much as Jefferson might have wished it had been. There was a postal service. There were some scattered forts with U.S. troops, and not much else. And there was no financial apparatus, no central bank, no national currency. There were no means to fight a big war or do anything else.
And when you say scattered troops, you really mean very few troops. What, 16,000 at one point?
16,000 troops. That's right. And most of them west of the Mississippi, involved in Indian wars, but nothing in the way that could have been marshaled to fight something like the Civil War.
You say in the book you're describing the situation in 1860, something you just alluded to, where the Treasury had literally run out of money. There was no way to raise taxes, no currency. And by no currency, talk about what that means. You really mean there was no fixed standard paper money. There was scattered.
Gold and silver coins, but those are cumbersome to carry around. They were relatively scarce. So what people did was they would lend assets to banks, and banks would issue notes. That was just IOUs. And if you went across the street from the bank and presented its note to a dry goods store or something, they'd probably honor it. But if you went a few cities away or something, they might discount it a little bit because they weren't so familiar with the bank. And if you went several states to the east, they discounted a whole lot or refuse it. And there were hundreds of these banks, and each had many different notes. So there were thousands of different notes issued by hundreds of different banks in 25 or 30 states. There was the same way if you get into an area with a lot of people from different nationalities speaking different tongues. Well, we had a polyglot currency that was not very workable in ordinary life and completely unworkable for raising the vast sums that might be needed for something like the Civil War.
Well, how surprised were you when you learned this, or did you know this about the currency? Because I think it'll strike a lot of people as very surprising that as late as 1860, it's not all that long ago in a sense, we were sort of slipshod in in our approach to dealing with money.
It's not a complete surprise, Daniel, growing out of the very question you asked before about this aversion to centralism. Someone's got to issue, if there's going to be one currency, someone's got to issue it. That someone was generally in the 19th century the central bank, the what started out in England and other places as the Bank to the King. And the U.S. had a central bank, but because of these very same passions against strong central government, we got rid of it. That was under James Madison, and we found we needed a central bank, so we formed another one that was called the Second Bank of the United States. And once again, it was done once again by a Democrat, of course, by Andrew Jackson. So, it was almost as if the ideology of the Democrats was better that people should go poor than submit to the tyranny of a central bank. So that is our political culture.
Let's talk about the geographic divisions, what the South did and what the North did, how the South became ever more decimated financially and how the North became successful. And the poverty and the awful quality of life that pervaded the South and the unwillingness of the land-owning class, the plantation-owning class who ran the South to, for example, tax. But as you pointed out, there was certainly a great willingness to die.
Yes. So when the war starts, both North and South realize they're going to need a lot of money to pay for it. Lincoln, in fact, said that the side with the most resources will win the war. Just to put an overlay on it, any government really can raise funds in one of three ways. They can tax it, meaning transfer some of the wealth from their citizens to the government coffers. They can borrow it, just borrowing the wealth of their citizens or overseas from others, or they can just print it. And in that case, you're not really printing wealth; you're just printing money and hope people accept it. And the extent to which you use any one of these influences the usefulness of the others. For instance, if you tax in sufficient quantities, you'll be more likely to attract lenders because they'll have more faith in the government. There are real resources behind this government. On the other hand, if you go haywire in printing money, no one's going to want to lend to you because you're going to be causing tremendous inflation, the fear of inflation, and people are going to back off. We're dealing with inflation in the United States today, and you can see how worried people are getting, even with approximately 8% inflation in the United States, which is the highest it's been in several decades. Well, they had a lot worse during the Civil War. The North, but the results North and South were very different, and I think they went a great deal of ways towards influencing the outcome. In the North, they proposed, I should say they began by borrowing gold from bankers. That was how they began to pay for the war during the first year. But there simply wasn't enough gold. To give you an idea, they arranged Salmon Chase, the Treasury Secretary under Lincoln, through very tortured negotiations, arranged to borrow $50 million of gold from the leading banks of the East Coast cities, New York, Boston, Philadelphia. The banks were very reluctant because it would basically clean them out. But under Chase's prodding and with patriotic motives, they agreed. They had a celebratory dinner. And in Washington, one of the bankers stood up and said, "Mr. Chase, Mr. Secretary, you got your $50 million. I hope you're happy. And this should do it. This should take care of all your needs for the war." So I have to tell you, Daniel, before the war was over, the government spent 60 times of the sum that had so frightened the bankers of the day. When it became apparent that that banks and the banks in that era were small, didn't have the capital to finance the war. The North went to a radical departure. Uh, they legislated something called legal tender, just pieces of paper that would have the legal standing of money. Just like the fiat money we have today, the dollar bills aren't backed by anything except the full faith and credit of the United States government. But back then, it was a very new idea and a frightening idea. People thought that only gold and silver were real money, had real intrinsic value. How could you call a piece of paper money? There were tremendous debates about this, quite philosophical and earnest, and at an intellectual level. But at the end of the day, the Lincoln government needed the money, and they thought that they were afraid that no one would accept these pieces of paper unless they had to. So they made them legal tender. They had to take them. And in fact, the people loved them. They called them Lincoln dollars, and of course, they called them greenbacks. And they were very happy to have be able to carry around a piece of paper and use for transactions that stores and others would accept. And the Lincoln government was able to use these pieces of paper to pay contractors and soldiers and pay for the war. They did, however, do something that was at the same time that I think was quite well advised. To reassure creditors, they also revolutionized the tax system. I say revolutionized, they really created a tax system. The government up until then had relied only on a small amount of money from land sales and on the tariff. Once the war started, shipping greatly dropped. There wasn't a lot of commerce during the war, certainly during the early stages of the war. And the Union needed a lot more tax revenue. So they created income tax, first ever, the progressive income tax. And then there were also all sorts of other taxes on specific industries and professions and fees and everything. To tax everything under the sun, as one legislator said. And this gave the federal government, for the first time, a real revenue base. And this reassured creditors and enabled the government to borrow even more money, several billions of dollars before the war was over, largely through now famous financier Jay Cooke, who went really town to town through a series of agents. Cooke had the insight that the American citizenry, if you could approach them in the right way, had the resources that, when accumulated, would be a decisive force in the war. And that really happened. He recruited newspapers and agents throughout the country. He bombarded them with ads. He pressed them to do their bit, just as the government would do later in the famous bond campaigns of World War I and World War II. But this all began with the Civil War. And it not only gave the Union the resources to fight the war, it saved the government from bankruptcy. And the Union emerged from the war, even having spent that all money, in better financial condition than it went into it, which is quite remarkable, really.
How tough of a sell was it when you're talking about, well, they instituted taxes? Okay, well, how difficult was that? How do you do that? Who were some of the visionary people who said, look, to get through this, to advance ourselves and maybe to ultimately win, we need to do this? What kind of conversations were had?
Well, it's a good question. There were very vigorous debates in Congress. One of the great fears was that for the first time, there were going to be federal tax assessors and federal tax collectors going into businesses and homes. And one of the opponents said, shouldn't we just leave collection to the states, which is what happened in the Confederacy, and which is how it had always been. And this fear of a strong federal government. Thaddeus Stevens, who is a vigorous nationalist and pro-federal government representative from Pennsylvania, replied very snarkily and sarcastically, will the tax collectors be any more numerous if they're working for the federal government rather than the states? Will they be any more odious to the people? He said again, quite sarcastically. And then he pointed out, in a more serious vein, but quite profoundly, that Stevens said it was this original defect under the Articles of Confederation that undid the first American framework, meaning the federal government, as it was first conceived after the Revolutionary War, had no taxing power and essentially had no revenue base. And that the government proved so weak under the Articles of Confederation that they had to call representatives and form a new constitution. So what Stevens was saying is the government we're defending now, its origins go to the need for taxing power. We tried this route once, putting all of the financial power in the states, and it didn't work. And even though they had no idea how much revenue the tax would raise, they had no estimation of popular income, much less whether people would pay the tax, whether they would evade it, and so on and so forth. But they passed it. This was in 1862, and significantly elevated later in the war. People were, I think, surprisingly willing to go along with it. Later after the war, when the need wasn't as urgent, people began to feel differently. Not surprisingly, but quite vast sums were raised with these taxes, income tax and other taxes, and with relatively few objections. So I think there was a patriotic feeling. One of the senators in the Finance Committee, John Sherman, who most people might know today as the author of the Sherman Antitrust Act several decades later, but he voiced a new sentiment. He said, we want to make everything as national as possible. So we want people to have contact with the federal government. We want people to be contributing to the federal government because, he said, in that way, people shall love their country, not their state, which had always been the emphasis before, but the federal government. That was the philosophy of the Republicans. And with the urgency of wartime, Northerners by and large went along with it.
Where did this come from in Lincoln, to loop it back to Lincoln, who's on the cover of your book, and as we've said, the endlessly fascinating figure? Where did this willingness or want to go in this direction come from him? Was it something, sort of a value system that he grew up with? Was it something that developed later on? Did he have people around him who pulled him in that direction, saying, look, we have to do this? Or was it part of his grand vision?
Well, another thing I hadn't realized about Lincoln is economics came very early to him. In fact, his main issues and virtually his only issues over his first 2 decades of his political career were economic issues. They were basically the issues of economic opportunity. He was a Whig. The Whigs were the party of Webster and Clay, Lincoln's heroes. And their platform was for a more vigorous federal government to do things like building canals and railroads, setting up a tariff to protect American industry against basically Britain and other European imports, reinstituting the central bank, the national bank that Jackson had done away with. These were issues that touched Lincoln at a most personal level. He'd grown up on the frontier in an area without transportation. He'd written in his campaign biography of having to drive a team of oxen across muddy and rutted roads. He'd traveled the roads of Illinois as a lawyer in central Illinois and experienced the hardship of it. He'd clerked for a store that he'd put it as had winked out as a lack of currency. So he believed very much in a strong national currency and a national bank to supply credit to the people. He very much believed in government taking the reins and helping to create opportunity. And along with these financial measures, the Lincoln government, as I alluded to, passed the Homestead Act, sort of an emblematic creator of opportunity bill, setting up farmers with a gift of land. A remarkable measure was the Morrill Act, the Land Grant College Bill, which created colleges for the middle class across the country. And these still exist. I went to Cornell, that was a land grant college. Michigan State, Penn State, Oregon State, and after the war, extended to a series of land grant colleges in the South as well. And the vision there was that college shouldn't only be for the wealthy and shouldn't only teach Greek and and theology, like they mainly did at the prestigious Ivy League schools, that they should be public schools teaching practical arts for middle-class Americans. To have done this in the midst of the Civil War at a time when fewer than 1% of Americans were in college, I just think a remarkable vision. As I said, Lincoln had always believed this in government. He reminded the people why they were fighting the war in that first address to Congress when he said, the leading object of government is to elevate the condition of men.
And contrast that with what the South did. Take us into the world of the South. What did they do with taxes or with?
So the South was very worried about big government. In some respects, you can see those historical patterns, political cultures retaining some resonance even today. Even going back before the war, the South was very worried about strong central government. There was a politician in North Carolina who put it very well. He said, if a government can build canals, it can more easily emancipate. Well, the South didn't want that. The South also, or I should say that the planters who really ran the southern states were very much afraid of raising the aspirations of poor whites. Wealth was not very well distributed in the South. They were also very afraid in the South of raising the aspirations of poor whites. Lincoln had the philosophy of every man should have the chance, and creating opportunities in colleges and so on for the lower orders, people like himself. He didn't have that vision in the South. If you go back even to the 1600s, the governor of Virginia said, I thank God, he said, that we do not have free public schooling in the South, and I hope that we shall not for 100 years. The South had a very unequal distribution of wealth, and they were afraid of doing anything that might raise the aspirations of commoners and perhaps make them discontented with the way things were. So they opposed government investing in internal infrastructure and railroads and canals. They opposed public funding for education. They opposed any kind of taxation because the wealth was heavily concentrated among the planter class in their land and slaves. And this is before the Civil War. Once the South seceded, they were very explicit about not having a strong central government. They made it illegal in the Southern Constitution to spend money on so-called internal improvements. They made it illegal to have a protective tariff, as the North had done. And they rejected things. They considered legal tender. The Greenback bill the North passed, but rejected it. And they rejected any kind of a vigorous taxing system because, as I said, the wealth was all in the planter class, and they were opposed to taxation. It was really remarkable that the Southerners were willing to fight and die in heroic and horrific numbers, but they weren't willing to part with their wealth for the cause of the Confederacy. And so, of course, the South had a problem. They had to pay for the war just as the North did. Their only wealth was in cotton. They were unable to ship cotton in anything like the quantities that they had before the war to Europe, particularly as the war went on and the Northern Navy, its blockade became more robust. And so, since they didn't have a revenue base, they were less able to borrow the revenue. No one trusted them. So that only left them with the third option, and that was printing money. You remember I said that the North was careful about the greenback and not overprinting it. Well, the South, had no such luxury. They just began to print bills. It became one of the great inflations in recorded history. A barrel of flour, just to take one very common, obviously necessary product, when the war began, cost $5.50 in the South. 2 years later, actually exactly 2 years later, in April 1863, by that time flour was scarce and the government was hoarding it for the troops. And people had begun to grow hungry. And in Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, there was actually a food riot led by women. Most of the men were off at the front, and they rioted. They broke into storehouses where the flour was kept. Not a good sign when wives and mothers of the people you want to fight for you were growing hungry. By that time, the price of flour had gone up to $38 a barrel, so 7 times as much. Remember, in the U.S. today, we're unhappy with 7 or 8% inflation. This was 7 times as much. By a year later, the price of flour was $200 a barrel. And by the time the last gun sounded at Appomattox in 1865, flour cost $1,000 in the South. Under that type of inflation, the economy completely broke down. The will to fight was often eroded. Soldiers began to desert in increasing numbers. Nobody wants to fight or is willing to fight if their family is starving. Their letters were, one woman wrote to the governor of North Carolina, "I don't know what we're fighting for. I think we're fighting to starve," he said. Although the Southern armies fought very bravely, their economy really broke down first and really undid them.
But just pause for 1 second here, because here we are in early, well, let's call it early spring 2022, and a new war has been sprung upon the world in Ukraine with the Russians attacking. What do you think the economic effects? You're a money person. You know a lot about money, and you write about money. What kind of economic effect you think it'll take before something like you're describing that happened in the South happens in Russia?
Well, it's a great comparison. Let's just go back for a minute with that comparison. So, what was the South thinking? They knew they weren't as wealthy as the North. They knew that all the industry in the country was in the North. Therefore, they knew that they were going to be reliant. Once the trade with the North stopped, they were going to have to go to Europe. They had to know the North was going to interrupt their shipping. What were they thinking? What they were thinking was that the world so needed their cotton that there would be a war. Cotton, by the way, was the oil and gas of the 19th century. It was the first big manufacturing industry, the Industrial Revolution. It really got the Industrial Revolution going. The South had 3/4 of the world's cotton. There were 1 million or more people employed in the mill cities of New England, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and England and France. And they were very dependent on the South. In 1858, the Southern Senator, James Hammond, got on the floor of the Senate and said, "Cotton is king. No one's going to make war on us." And the South really believed that they were immune. And when they seceded, it was out of a belief that the North would never dare attack them because the North needed their cotton. And that if they did, Britain and France would somehow intervene and stop the war because they would need their cotton. Well, this was just a colossal miscalculation, as we've seen with the war happening and the South suffering really economic devastation, which really ended its ability to fight the war. So now let's go to Russia. Russia is sitting pretty with a different commodity cartel, of course, an energy cartel. Europe is extremely dependent on it. Germany is the biggest economy in Europe. And last figure I saw, Germany got 55% of its gas from Russia and 45% of its oil. So naturally, Putin figured that he could pretty much have his way with the Ukraine, as he had with the eastern parts of the Ukraine and earlier with Kazakhstan and Belarus and Chechnya and so on, and nobody would lift a finger. Oil was king, he might have said, just like Senator Hammond had said it in the U.S. Senate 160 years earlier. I think what's happened is that we can see already, we don't know who's going to win the shooting war, but it's obviously a lot tougher than Putin figured. The Ukrainians are resisting bravely and courageously, and the West has responded with very vigorous sanctions. The U.S. has already embargoed any Russian energy products, and the other Western nations are, as we speak, assessing so far lesser, but still their own sanctions on Russian energy. And I suspect that before we're done, there won't be a drop of oil or any gas imported by any Western or NATO state from Russia.
How long does it take for sanctions to have a serious effect? I heard someone on now, not that, of course, you don't believe everything you hear. I certainly believe what you say, though, Roger Lowenstein. I heard someone say, well, it can take months or years even for the magnitude of sanctions that have been imposed on Russia to have such a stark effect as they are meant to have. But on the other hand, certainly if the average person on his way to work at an office building in downtown Moscow stops for a venti skim latte, at Starbucks every morning, and now that's closed, that's okay, not the biggest deal in the world, but it's not nothing.
So they can live without their Starbucks, I think. But what if they can live without other imported products? Although, it'll start to implant in the average Russian's mind, hey, there's a cost to this war. But what if they have trouble pulling money out of the bank? Or if when they do pull money out of the bank, the cost of goods, the price of goods is going up a lot because after all, there are no foreign supplies and there are fewer supplies. And so what's left, supply and demand, things start to cost more. Now there's inflation and people don't like sudden inflation. What if also they're not able to use their credit card, their Visas and their MasterCards because there's been a complete interruption in the banking system? Now, all those steps haven't happened yet. It really depends on the severity, but I suspect that if the war goes into not just weeks, but months and many months, the sanctions are going to get tighter and tighter. They start with things like activities that seem to be directly helpful to the war effort. So, lending the Russians money or supplying them aircraft parts. And I think they're going to spread to anything that supports the Russian economy in any way. One of the Confederate leaders back in the Civil War said we weren't whipped at the battlefield, we were whipped in the Treasury Department. I think that the Russians are slowly being whipped in the Treasury Department. And I think, to answer your question, in some matter of months, there are going to be very real hardships on the Russian people economically, even on people who were innocent. And we wouldn't want to suffer, but the Putin government is going to be less popular, at least behind closed doors. And then, of course, the $64 question, 64 ruble question, is what means are there in Russia, which is not a democracy, for them to make their discontent known. But they're going to start to hear casualty tolls coming back from the front. That they've been told that there's no real war, but that's not going to fly as more and more of their sons are not coming home. So I think it's impossible to pinpoint a time, but in areas, again, to go back to the Confederacy, North Carolina was so opposed to the toll of the war that it was on the verge of seceding itself from the secession government of the Confederacy. And there were various backwoods areas in many states that had effectively pulled out. They were patrolled with civilian militia. No Confederate troops could enter. And, they had seceded from the secession. There was real civilian discontent. And regardless of the form of the government, that will take its toll. I think the Russians are going to see that in a lesser or greater number of months.
One thing we've talked about before on this program is Putin's co-opting of the great Russian culture, whether it's Tchaikovsky or Tolstoy, and using it for his own means. Playing Tchaikovsky at the opening of the Sochi Olympics as if Tchaikovsky would have anything to do with Putin under the sun. But on this program, because it's talking beats, and I am, after all, in music, we always do talk a little bit about music here, and I'm always curious to see what people are listening to and what music does. What does it do for you, Roger Lowenstein?
Well, it stirs me. And when I hear Tchaikovsky, it stirs me. Or Rachmaninoff, who's my favorite Russian composer and probably favorite composer any ethnicity. And I think it's important not to let this war isn't against Russian people. It's not against the Russian ethnicity. The music isn't any different today than it was 2 weeks ago before the war started. So, I'm going to continue to be stirred by Russian and other great music, and uh, hope that we can prevail in the war.
Indeed, I was just in the car with a colleague recently. We were driving to a chamber music concert, and there had been a lot of snafus with bad weather and things like that. And there we were somewhere along the route, and a little bleary-eyed. And then he put on the third piano concerto of Rachmaninoff in the legendary recording played by Arthur Rubinstein with Fritz Reiner conducting. And when it first started, it just hit me like a punch in the solar plexus. And there I was, wide awake for the duration. It was so good and so powerful. And it's a absolutely must-have, must-hear.
The passion of it and the gravitas and the passion, it's as if it were had been written to be the score for a great battle scene, perhaps.
Absolutely.
Or perhaps a great human personal tragedy, but of which Rachmaninoff knew plenty in his own life. But it's music that hits you in the solar plexus for sure.
Roger Lowenstein, as you look towards the future, you tend to write about financial related topics, and here you've taken a deep dive into the past, into a ever fascinating man, Lincoln, and this period of American history that was so altering for the rest of the world, even the rest of the country, the Civil War, what happened during and after. So when you look at today, when you look at all the problems we have getting anything passed in a bipartisan way. I understand you're not a politician and not necessarily a political reporter, but you look at the 37th Congress and some of the things they did, some of the groundbreaking decisions they made, the Transcontinental Railroad, the great federal investments in agriculture, education, the progressive income tax, the IRS, all these things that were done in a bipartisan manner. What do we need to do right now for our economy to put us in good footing so that people my age and generation coming up next can feel confident about the future?
I think we obviously lack leadership in Washington and elsewhere. Lincoln had, he was just so wise and so humble. He didn't try to lecture the people or harangue them. Lowell, the great Harvard poet of his time, said that he leads so gently, he almost seems to be following the people. Of course, he wasn't following, but he was a pragmatic politician. He was opportunistic. He didn't get too far out ahead, but he, as Lowell said, led them ever so gently. And I think what was attractive about Lincoln, well, many things were attractive about Lincoln, but in particular, a quality that we lack today was his humility. He was, long before he was president, he served one term in Congress, a time in Washington prior, and he was defending a bill of his for internal improvements against a withering attack, scathing attack. And all he said was, in reply to this gentleman in the other party who just excoriated Lincoln, he said, most things, especially of government policy, aren't all good or all evil. Most things have some good and some evil in them, and we're just looking for things that have more good than evil. Such a beautifully restrained, modest, humble way of presenting his policy that we think this has a little more good than evil. And maybe if we had more statesmen who advanced their briefs in that spirit, that we could accomplish more.
More statesmen in that spirit of Lincoln. Okay, I don't know if I'll hold my breath, but I'll certainly go hear some Rachmaninoff in the meantime and take my mind off it all, and then we'll come right back and have the same problems. In the meantime, Roger Lowenstein with new book in hand, which is hot off the press. Hopefully will illuminate many subjects, ways and means, Lincoln and his cabinet and the financing of the Civil War. Indeed, sir, I thank you very much.
Daniel, it's been a pleasure talking.
You've been listening to Talking Beats with me, Daniel Lalchuk. Don't forget to give us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and write a review if you would. That really helps. The original music for this show is by Ronald Markham. The producer is Doug Christian. For more information, visit the website of the show, talkingbeats.com. Thank you for listening. This is Talking Beats with Daniel Lalchuk.